Right now, as you're watching this video, your adult decisions, your relationship patterns, your deepest fears, and even your career choices are being unconsciously controlled by emotional wounds that were carved into your psyche before you were old enough to understand what was happening to you. And until you become conscious of these invisible forces, you'll keep repeating the same destructive patterns while wondering why your life feels stuck in cycles you can't seem to break. But before we dive into this life-changing exploration of how childhood trauma continues to shape your adult life in ways you've never realized, based on the revolutionary insights of Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, I need you to do something for me right now. Hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because what I'm about to share with you about the hidden influence of early wounds could completely transform your understanding of why you do what you do and feel what you feel. We live in a culture that tells us to get over our childhood, to move on from the past, to focus on the present and future, rather than dwelling on what happened years or decades ago. We're told that successful adults don't blame their problems on their upbringing. That personal responsibility means taking control of your life, regardless of what happened when you were young. And while there's some truth to the importance of personal agency and forward-looking action, this cultural attitude completely misses one of the most fundamental discoveries of modern psychology. Both Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, despite their famous disagreements about many aspects of human psychology, agreed on this crucial point. The experiences that shape us most profoundly happen during our earliest years, when our brains are most plastic, our defenses are least developed, and our understanding of the world is being formed through emotional experience rather than rational analysis. These early experiences don't just influence us temporarily and then fade away. They become the unconscious foundation upon which our entire personality, our relationship patterns, and our approach to life are built. Freud was the first to systematically explore how childhood experiences create what he called psychic wounds that continue to influence adult behavior through unconscious mechanisms. He discovered that traumatic or emotionally significant events from early childhood get repressed into the unconscious mind, where they continue to exert powerful influence over our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors without our awareness. These repressed experiences don't disappear. They go underground and begin to shape our lives from the shadows, but Jung took this understanding even deeper. While Freud focused primarily on sexual and aggressive drives that get repressed in childhood, Jung recognized that the wounds we carry from early life are more complex and multifaceted. Jung understood that children are incredibly sensitive to the emotional atmosphere of their families, that they absorb not just direct trauma, but also the unspoken tensions, the unexpressed emotions, the family secrets, and the unconscious patterns that their parents and caregivers carry from their own wounded childhoods. Jung called this the psychic inheritance that gets passed down through generations. Children don't just inherit their parents' eye color and height. They also inherit their parents' unresolved psychological conflicts, their defensive patterns, their relationship dynamics, and their unconscious beliefs about themselves and the world. This means that the wounds shaping your adult life might not even be your own wounds in the direct sense, but rather the inherited emotional patterns that have been passed down through your family lineage for generations. This is why Jung emphasized that understanding your childhood wounds isn't about blaming your parents or wallowing in victimhood, but about becoming conscious of the unconscious forces that are still running your life so that you can finally make genuinely free choices rather than unconsciously repeating inherited patterns. Let me give you some examples of how this actually works in practice. If you grew up in a household where love was conditional on performance, where you only received attention and approval when you achieved something or behaved perfectly, you likely developed what psychologists call a performance-based identity. As an adult, you might find yourself constantly striving, never feeling good enough, unable to rest or enjoy your accomplishments, because your unconscious mind is still trying to earn the love and approval that felt so precarious in childhood. You might not even remember specific incidents where your parents made their love conditional, but your nervous system remembers the feeling of having to perform to be worthy of attention. This creates what Jung called a complex, an autonomous cluster of emotions, memories, and behavioral patterns that gets triggered in situations that unconsciously remind you of those early experiences of conditional love. Or perhaps you grew up in a household where emotions were dangerous, where expressing anger, sadness, or even excitement led to punishment, rejection, or emotional overwhelm from caregivers who couldn't handle their own feelings, let alone yours. As an adult, you might find yourself unable to access your own emotions, constantly intellectualizing your experiences, feeling numb or disconnected from your inner life, or alternatively, feeling overwhelmed by emotions that seem to come out of nowhere. Your adult relationships might be characterized by emotional distance, fear of intimacy, or a pattern of attracting partners who are either emotionally unavailable themselves or who become frustrated with your inability to connect emotionally. You might not understand why you can't seem to feel things the way other people do, why emotional conversations feel threatening, or why you shut down when conflict arises. Freud would say that your natural emotional expression was repressed in childhood because it wasn't safe, and now those repressed emotions are either completely inaccessible to your conscious mind, or they emerge in distorted ways through symptoms, compulsions, or relationship problems. Jung would add that this emotional repression has become part of your persona, the mask you wear to navigate the world, while your authentic emotional self has been relegated to what he called the shadow, the parts of yourself that you've learned to hide or deny. Or consider the wound of abandonment, which can occur not just through obvious events like divorce or death, but through more subtle experiences like having parents who were physically present but emotionally unavailable, who were overwhelmed by their own problems, or who were inconsistent in their availability and responsiveness. Children who experience abandonment wounds often develop what attachment theorists call anxious or avoidant attachment styles that continue to shape their adult relationships in profound ways. If you developed an anxious attachment style, you might find yourself constantly seeking reassurance from partners, feeling panicked when people don't respond to your messages quickly, interpreting normal relationship conflicts as signs that you're about to be abandoned, or staying in unhealthy relationships because the fear of being alone feels worse than the pain of being mistreated. Your nervous system is still responding to the childhood terror of being left alone, even though you're now an adult who could actually take care of yourself. If you developed an avoidant attachment style, you might find yourself uncomfortable with too much closeness, sabotaging relationships when they start to feel too intimate, maintaining emotional walls that keep people at a safe distance, or convincing yourself that you don't really need deep connections with others. Your unconscious mind learned that depending on others leads to disappointment and pain, so it developed strategies to protect you from that vulnerability, even though those same strategies now prevent you from experiencing the love and connection you actually crave. Jung understood that these attachment wounds don't just affect romantic relationships, they influence every area of life. Your relationship with authority figures, your comfort with success and visibility, your ability to trust your own judgment, your capacity for creativity and self-expression, your relationship with money and security. All of these are shaped by the early experiences that taught you fundamental lessons about safety, worthiness, and belonging. But here's what makes Jung's approach to childhood wounds so revolutionary. He didn't see them as permanent damage that you're stuck with for life. Jung understood that wounds also contain the seeds of your greatest gifts and potentials. The very experiences that created your deepest pain also developed your most profound capacities for empathy, wisdom, creativity, and healing. Jung called this the wounded healer archetype, the understanding that our greatest wounds often become the source of our greatest contributions to the world. The child who learned to be hypervigilant about other people's emotions might grow up to be an incredibly intuitive therapist, artist, or leader. The child who experienced abandonment might develop an extraordinary capacity for independence and self-reliance. The child who felt different or rejected might become someone who creates space for other outsiders to belong. This doesn't mean that childhood wounds are good or that trauma is beneficial. It means that the human psyche has an incredible capacity for transformation, and that the same sensitivity and depth that made you vulnerable to wounding in childhood can become your greatest strengths when you learn to work with them consciously. Freud's great contribution was helping us understand that childhood experiences continue to influence us through unconscious mechanisms, and that bringing these unconscious patterns into conscious awareness is the first step toward freedom. His method of psychoanalysis was designed to help people uncover the repressed memories and emotions that were still controlling their lives from the shadows. But Jung went further by recognizing that healing childhood wounds isn't just about understanding what happened to you intellectually, but about developing a new relationship with the wounded parts of yourself. Jung understood that within your psyche, there are still childlike parts that carry the pain, fear, and unmet needs from your early experiences. These inner children don't need to be analyzed away. They need to be acknowledged, understood, and integrated with compassion. This is where Jung's concept of individuation becomes crucial for healing childhood wounds. Individuation is the process of becoming conscious of all the different parts of yourself, including the wounded child parts that you might prefer to ignore, and learning to relate to them with wisdom and care rather than judgment and rejection. Many people try to heal their childhood wounds by disowning their vulnerability, by becoming so strong and independent that they never have to feel the pain of those early experiences again. But Jung understood that this approach actually keeps you trapped in the wound because you're still being controlled by the need to avoid feeling what you felt as a child. True healing happens when you can acknowledge the reality of what you experienced, feel the emotions that you couldn't safely feel at the time, and develop the capacity to give yourself what you needed but didn't receive. This doesn't mean becoming self-indulgent or using your wounds as an excuse for destructive behavior. It means developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold both your wounded child self and your capable adult self simultaneously, allowing them to inform and support each other. This brings us to one of the most important distinctions between Freud's and Jung's approaches to childhood wounds, their understanding of what healing actually looks like and how it happens. Freud believed that the goal of therapy was to make the unconscious conscious, to bring repressed memories and emotions into awareness so that they would lose their power to control behavior from the shadows. His famous statement, "Where it was, there ego shall be," reflects his belief that rational consciousness should ultimately dominate unconscious impulses. But Jung recognized that this purely rational approach to healing often fails because it doesn't address the deeper spiritual and creative dimensions of human nature that are also wounded in childhood. Jung understood that childhood wounds don't just damage our capacity for rational functioning, they also damage our connection to what he called the self, the deeper, more authentic part of our being that transcends our wounded ego and our defensive personas. Jung observed that many of his patients who had successfully analyzed their childhood experiences and understood their psychological patterns intellectually were still not truly healed. They could explain their problems brilliantly, but they couldn't seem to change their fundamental relationship to life. They remained stuck in what Jung called the provisional life, living as if their real life would begin someday when they finally got their act together, when they finally healed completely, when they finally became the person they thought they should be. Jung realized that this provisional attitude toward life was itself a symptom of childhood wounding. Children who grow up feeling that they're not acceptable as they are, that they need to become someone different to be worthy of love, often carry this feeling into adulthood as a persistent sense that their current life is just a rehearsal for their real life. They're always preparing to live, always working on themselves, always waiting for some future moment when they'll finally be ready to fully engage with life. This is why Jung emphasized that healing childhood wounds requires not just understanding them, but also developing what he called a religious attitude toward life. Not necessarily religious in a traditional sense, but an attitude of reverence, meaning, and connection to something larger than your wounded ego. Jung understood that childhood wounds often damage our sense of belonging to life itself, our feeling that we have a right to exist and to take up space in the world. Many childhood wounds carry the implicit message that you're too much or not enough, that your natural way of being is somehow wrong or unacceptable. These messages get internalized as what Jung called negative complexes, autonomous parts of the psyche that carry shame, self-criticism, and self-rejection. These complexes continue to operate in adulthood, creating an internal environment that's hostile to your own growth and self-expression. Jung discovered that these negative complexes can't be healed through analysis alone, because they're not just psychological problems, they're spiritual wounds that require spiritual healing. They need to be met with what Jung called active imagination, a process of engaging with the wounded parts of yourself through imagery, dialogue, creative expression, and embodied experience, rather than just intellectual understanding. For example, if you carry a complex around feeling unwanted or burdensome, you might work with this through active imagination by visualizing the child part of yourself that first felt this way, dialoguing with that child, asking what they need, and then imaginatively providing comfort, protection, and reassurance. You might express this complex through art, movement, or writing, allowing the feelings to move through your body rather than just staying trapped in your head. Jung also understood that healing childhood wounds often requires what he called compensation, developing the qualities and capacities that were underdeveloped or damaged in childhood. If you grew up in an environment where your creativity was discouraged, healing might involve deliberately cultivating your creative expression. If you grew up feeling powerless, healing might involve learning to set boundaries and advocate for yourself. If you grew up feeling isolated, healing might involve learning to build genuine community and connection, but Jung was careful to distinguish between healthy compensation and what he called overcompensation. Overcompensation happens when you try to heal a wound by swinging to the opposite extreme. For example, someone who felt powerless as a child might become controlling and dominating as an adult, or someone who felt rejected might become people-pleasing and self-sacrificing. These overcompensations don't actually heal the original wound. They just create new problems while keeping the underlying pain hidden. Healthy compensation involves developing missing qualities while also integrating and accepting the wounded parts of yourself. It's not about becoming the opposite of what you were as a wounded child. It's about becoming whole enough to include both your vulnerability and your strength, both your sensitivity and your resilience, both your need for connection and your capacity for independence. This is where Jung's understanding of the individuation process becomes so valuable for healing childhood wounds. Individuation isn't about becoming perfect or eliminating all your psychological problems. It's about becoming conscious of all the different parts of yourself, including the wounded parts, and learning to relate to them with wisdom, compassion, and integration, rather than judgment, rejection, or identification. Jung also recognized that childhood wounds often contain what he called unlived life, potentials and possibilities that were shut down or suppressed because they weren't safe or acceptable in your family environment. Part of healing involves not just addressing the damage that was done, but also reclaiming and developing the aspects of yourself that were forced underground. For instance, if you grew up in a family where emotional expression was dangerous, you might have suppressed not just your difficult emotions like anger and sadness, but also your capacity for joy, excitement, and spontaneity. Healing involves not just learning to feel and express difficult emotions safely, but also reclaiming your right to experience and express the full spectrum of human feeling. Or if you grew up in an environment where your intelligence or creativity threatened others, you might have learned to hide your gifts, to play small to avoid standing out or shining too brightly. Healing involves not just addressing the fear of visibility and success, but also actively developing and expressing your talents and capabilities. Jung understood that this process of reclaiming unlived life often involves what he called going against the family system. This doesn't mean rejecting your family or becoming hostile toward your upbringing, but it does mean choosing to develop aspects of yourself that might be different from, or even threatening to, the family patterns you inherited. This can be one of the most challenging aspects of healing childhood wounds because it often involves disappointing people you love, setting boundaries with family members who are still operating from their own unhealed wounds, and tolerating the anxiety that comes from breaking generational patterns. Your family system has an investment in keeping you in the role you played as a child, and when you start to change and grow, it can create significant disruption and resistance. Jung called this the guilt of individuation, the natural guilt that arises when you choose your own authentic development over family loyalty and conformity. This guilt is often one of the biggest obstacles to healing childhood wounds because it can feel like betraying the people who raised you, even when staying loyal to dysfunctional family patterns is betraying yourself. But Jung emphasized that true healing ultimately serves not just your own development, but the healing of your entire family lineage. When you break destructive patterns in your own life, you prevent them from being passed down to future generations. When you heal your own wounds consciously, you become capable of relating to others, including your family members, with greater wisdom and compassion. This brings us to one of Jung's most profound insights about childhood wounds. They're not just personal problems, but part of what he called the collective shadow, the unhealed wounds and destructive patterns that get passed down through families, communities, and entire cultures. Your individual healing is part of a larger process of collective healing that's happening across generations. Jung understood that many of the wounds we carry from childhood aren't just the result of our parents' personal failings, but reflect larger cultural and historical traumas that have been passed down through generations. Wars, economic depressions, cultural oppression, forced migrations, and other collective traumas create wounds that get transmitted to children who weren't even alive when the original trauma occurred. This means that healing your childhood wounds often involves not just personal work, but also understanding and healing the larger cultural and historical context that shaped your family's patterns. It might involve learning about your family's immigration story, understanding how historical events affected your grandparents and great-grandparents, or recognizing how cultural messages about gender, race, class, or religion influenced your upbringing. Jung also recognized that childhood wounds often involve what he called archetypal wounding, damage to our connection with the fundamental patterns and energies that Jung believed were universal aspects of human experience. For example, wounds around the mother archetype might affect not just your relationship with your personal mother, but your entire relationship with nurturing, receptivity, and the feminine principle. Wounds around the father archetype might affect your relationship with authority, structure, and the masculine principle. Healing archetypal wounds requires not just personal work, but also reconnecting with the healthy expressions of these universal patterns through mythology, spirituality, nature, and community. It might involve finding mentors who can model healthy expressions of the archetypal energies that were distorted in your childhood. It might involve engaging with stories, rituals, and practices that help you reconnect with the sacred dimensions of human experience that were damaged in your early life. So how do you actually begin the process of identifying and healing the childhood wounds that are still shaping your adult life? How do you start to become conscious of the unconscious patterns that Freud and Jung understood were controlling your behavior from the shadows? First, start paying attention to your patterns. Notice what triggers strong emotional reactions in you, what situations make you feel like a child again, what relationship dynamics you find yourself repeating despite your best intentions. These patterns are often pointing toward unhealed wounds that are still active in your psyche. Second, explore your family history with curiosity rather than judgment. What patterns can you see across generations? What traumas, losses, or challenges shaped your parents and grandparents? What family rules, spoken or unspoken, influenced how emotions were handled, how conflict was managed, how success and failure were understood? Third, practice what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. Instead of trying to eliminate your wounded parts or become someone completely different, learn to hold both your wounds and your strengths, both your vulnerability and your resilience, both your past and your potential simultaneously. Fourth, develop a relationship with your inner child through active imagination, creative expression, or therapeutic work. This isn't about becoming childish, but about acknowledging and caring for the parts of yourself that still carry childhood pain and unmet needs. Fifth, find ways to express and develop the unlived life that was suppressed in your childhood. What aspects of yourself were you not allowed to express? What talents or interests were discouraged? What parts of your authentic nature did you learn to hide? Remember, healing childhood wounds isn't about erasing your past or becoming someone completely different. It's about becoming conscious of how your past is still influencing your present so that you can make genuinely free choices rather than unconsciously repeating inherited patterns. It's about integrating all parts of yourself, including the wounded parts, with wisdom and compassion. This is your invitation to stop running from your childhood wounds and start understanding how they're still shaping your life. The patterns that feel most automatic, most beyond your control, are often the ones that were formed earliest and run deepest. But with consciousness, courage, and compassion, these same patterns can become gateways to your greatest healing and most authentic self-expression. If this resonates with you, share in the comments one pattern in your adult life that you now realize might be connected to a childhood wound. And don't forget to subscribe for more insights into the profound wisdom of depth psychology, because understanding the unconscious forces that shape your life is the first step toward genuine freedom and authentic living.